panic. And these are tied to survival of our species. If you notice the end of the little arrow in what we call the limbic system, that's approximately where our amygdala is located. So, about 6 months of age, we start having our emotions that come on board. And I like to think of the amygdala as kind of like a recording system of what goes on. I'll talk about that again in a second. So, this is an idea of some of the emotions that come on, like joy and happiness and anger. You kind of look through this. One of the things you're not going to see is hate. And we also don't see love there. And those are considered kind of composite emotions that we really haven't gone much detail on. Now, our brain loves to look for patterns, especially what we call the limbic system or the primitive part of the brain. It likes us to have predictability in our lives. Why? Because it's all about survival. And so it's constantly looking around when we're a small child as to how are the people around us that are bigger than us, how are they surviving out there in the world? How are they reacting? And so it becomes a situation where we look first to our family and those closest to us in terms of emotional expression. And these kind of represent my family. As I'm mentioning, my mom is Greek, so family dinners were quite an occasion during holidays. I mean, someone would say the gravy looks lumpy, and 10 people would show up in the kitchen and they would talk very loudly, and arms would go all over the place. And next thing you know, everything was calmed down and people were happy with the gravy. As opposed to my dad's family, which was a very old New Orleans family, which knew how to have a good time, but we certainly didn't go into the drama that the Greek families had. So we're watching these reactions when we're a child and trying to determine, what's appropriate for us. And I would have to say that I ended up taking more after my dad's family. But I certainly have a sister who can really express herself in the great traditions of the Greeks. So, from an international point of view, all of us around the world have the same emotions come on at the same time, approximately the same time in our development. But what makes us different is definitely the expression of those emotions. Now, another thing that a lot of people don't understand, which I think is important too when we talk later about cultural, is the fact that we can actually catch our emotions from each other. And many times people are unaware of this. I talk about a lot of times in a corporate setting, like you may walk into a meeting and you're in a great mood, and all of a sudden you kind of get that official psychology term that I call yuckiness. And you're like, what's happening here? Why do I feel this way? I felt fine before I walked in here. Well, chances are you have caught somebody's anxiety or anxious state. And usually it's conveyed through our breathing patterns a lot of times. So when we short breathe or we hold our breath, that kind of sends a signal out to other humans around us that there's some kind of danger. And we pick that up on an unconscious basis and we start kind of mimicking that particular pattern. And once we do, if we're not aware of what's happening so we can be proactive, we might find that we're reacting to that situation and taking ourselves somewhere where we may not want to go. So very similar to the woman in the picture on the right, many times slowing our breathing patterns down, taking deep breaths can help us relieve that particular emotional state that we've just caught from somebody else. So I think therefore a note. All right, so how do I prevent myself from being in the world and catching someone else's emotions, or how can I keep my emotions under control more or express them correctly? And, is any of that really even important? Well, I'm going to give you a couple examples. When I go out to meetings, a lot of times meeting with business leaders in the Valley, I hear this over and over again of what trait they are looking for in their leaders. And that's sometimes what we call the mom trait of empathy, that being able to identify with others. And I hear this over and over again, how there is a lack of that, and they're really searching out people that can come into management positions because they feel that this is a critical trait. Another example of this, and I talked earlier about being a graduate of Michigan State. Well, a few years ago, it was really exciting because Connor Cook was the quarterback from Michigan State, and he was excellent. He took the MSU team to the Rose Bowl. And, my initial thought was, oh my gosh, this guy is going to have a great career in the NFL, which he went for the draft, but he was drafted at a very, very high number and kind of ignored. And so I started doing some research as to what was the problem here. Why was he not picked up? And the issue was that he was never elected team captain, meaning that coaches in the NFL felt that he could not connect well with team members. And so they went on to look at others. And it's, again, hard to imagine that even looking at a quarterback and the quality of a quarterback, empathy is something that is looked for. So how do we then look at our emotional state? How can we improve our emotional state in our reactions? Well, one way is through emotional intelligence. And I would say to all of you, I wish I'd known about this so much earlier than what I did, because I like things that empower people, and I really feel that this is an area that we can help ourselves with and that we can empower ourselves with. So what is emotional intelligence? Let me go on to a little diagram here that will kind of explain it. So there are 4 parts to emotional intelligence, and I'm going to break each of these parts down. One is what I see, the other is what I do. It has to do with me personally, but it also has to do with social awareness and relationships that I build. So let's kind of break this down and look at some of the skill levels that are involved here. The first is, it starts with self-awareness. How are you feeling during the day? I mean, that kind of sounds like a ridiculous question, but there are times when we've had our emotions kind of hijacked by our parents, where it's really confusing then as an adult of how I'm feeling. You say, oh, mom, dad, I feel sad. You don't feel sad. Go out and play. And, we hear these things over and over again. And so then we get into doubt. What am I actually feeling here? Is it an appropriate feeling? And looking at people that make you happy, that make you sad, and that, what can I learn from my emotional state? If I'm always walking into a meeting and I'm really uptight and anxious, what does it tell me about what I'm thinking in terms of that meeting and being part of that? Is there things that I can do to change that? I mean, one of the hardest things that I think people don't understand is we many times can select our emotional state. We just don't think we can. So the first is starting with how I feel during the day, evaluating that. What emotion am I connecting with? The other is self-control. Now, remember that whole idea that expression is something that we are taught. So, again, many times we want to react. In fact, I would say that, following I have a cousin, well, on my mom's side, so he has the Greek heritage as well as I, and he's a psychologist, been 50 years in Ann Arbor as a child psychologist. And we talk about this fact that a lot of times we got to kind of talk ourselves back from reacting. And so, this is something that I think we all could use of saying, I want a moment to think about what's happening here. It is my initial reaction, correct. And again, I go back into large environments because many times we connect who we are in the world with the job that we're doing. And then we have management that comes to us and says, well, you got to change this, or this is going to happen. And we tend to take it really personally, and they're doing this to me. Well, maybe they're doing this because there's 500 other people in the company and they've got to connect differently on that. So take a moment to think about it, or even say to yourself, how do I want to feel 10 minutes from now? We're not really trained to this. We're trained a lot of times to react to things, and react out of fear. So taking that moment in this culture where everything has to be immediate can be the best thing that we can do in preventing a future problem down the line. We can choose to have positive outcomes and still feel like everything is working really successfully with that outcome. The other aspect is social awareness. How are people thinking or feeling? And, we've all had those experiences where we run into someone and say, hey, how are you? And they go, fine. And we go, great. But have we really looked at them? Have we really looked at what their body language is conveying, what's in their eyes? And are we seeing things from different perspectives? I mean, sometimes we have to anticipate the needs of other people, ask a few more questions about what is going on. And the other thing that I think is important is we're getting more and more to the point where if somebody comes at us in anger, we want to push back in anger. And we see this with road rage. We see this in look at airplanes and what's happening on airplanes where people are feeling very violated and such. And there are times when we can stop that anger. And an example I use from my corporate years is where I was working on a huge proposal. I needed help from one of the other managers. I sent her an email. And I got this email back that was a little fiery, and obviously I had totally upset her. And, evaluating my email, I'm like, I don't know what I did. I can't understand this. And I decided to go talk to her in person, which is one of the next steps we'll talk about. So on our way down to her office, again, sometimes corporate culture can be interesting. People were saying, well, I know what you did, but you're really upset Amy. And, and she did have a reputation for being a little fiery. So when I got to her office, she immediately started letting me know how I had offended her. And when she finally caught her breath, I said, look, I have too much respect for you to take this to a negative point. What do I need to do to fix this? And she sat down. And then I sat down. And we were able to solve it. But if I had gone in there with anger and said, I'm going to really put her back into her place, number one, my goal was to get my bid done. And I needed help doing that. I needed cooperation. And the fact was, I had a lot of respect for her. I didn't want to take anything to a negative point of view. So just because someone comes at us negatively doesn't mean we have to respond that way. The other part is relationship management. And I've got to say, this is where I saw a lot of people in my corporate years fail. When I first went into technology and technology sales, I could go in by myself. And I knew all the answers because I did. It was easy. But by the time I get 20 years down the road, I'm taking 10 people in for me, and some of them internationally. because technology became so much more sophisticated. And you've got to manage those relationships. You've got to have the cooperation of people. And a lot of times, you can't come at someone that doesn't work for your company and say, I'm going to get you fired as a way to build that relationship. So this is going to become more and more important because a lot of times in our teams, we are going to have an international footprint on those particular teams. I always say laughter is the best medicine, but you have to be careful. I'm not talking sarcasm. I'm talking diffusion of a really fiery situation that works well. So these are the part of emotional intelligence. And again, I love this because I can make a conscious decision that I want to react differently and really start helping to educate myself on what I can choose to do in other situations. Now, how do we build a cultural bridge? Do we use some of the things that we've talked about in terms of development of our emotions or emotional intelligence to do that? Well, here's where we kind of stand. One of the questions that I had in the beginning was, does emotional intelligence help us with cultural intelligence? And the verdict on that is, well, there is a big gap. And we still really don't know whether emotional intelligence crosses fully to cultures. But, one of the things we have to understand to really understand a culture, we might need 5 to 7 years to really absorb in that culture. So I like solutions that we can apply now, today. And so using the principles of emotional intelligence, what I've looked at is how can we start in steps? And one of the first steps is cultural humility, being humble about who we are. And I'm going to talk about these other ones here briefly as we go along, but I'm going to really concentrate on cultural humility. So there's our definition here, or at least one. There are some variety, but they're pretty much related. Lifelong process, self-reflection, self-critiquing, where we not only learn about other people's cultures, but we also look at examining our beliefs and our cultural identities. So how might that work? Well, first of all, by going through and being a little bit more humble about things, we can go back to the way our brain processes information. Remember, we're looking for familiar cues. Well, those cues may not be familiar when we start looking and interacting with other cultures. And we've talked about this in the past in terms of eye contact. So in the majority of American culture, we think eye contact is really important. Now, there are other cultures within our culture that don't believe that, and certainly other cultures around the world that are uncomfortable with that. In terms of space, our personal space on that aspect of it, again, Americans like their personal space, and I can identify with that because that's how I feel too. And it's interesting to see that the Greeks that I was raised around, that were raised in the US, we had space, right? But then the relatives would come from Greece. There was no such thing as space, at that point. And I remember feeling that discomfort as a child, going, oh my gosh, this person's way too close to me. And so by kind of questioning what is the familiar for me may not be familiar for other people, that might help us in terms of building a little bit more awareness. The other thing is just even looking at ideas of aggression. Most of us feel if somebody's really yelling at us, that could be an aggressive act. Well, the Greeks again, I just had a good friend that was spent 2 weeks in Greece, and she said, at first I thought I went to the angriest planet, our country on the planet. And later I realized they were just really passionate, that they had a point and they wanted to make their point, and they were very passionate about it. And looking at someone that's smiling, it's kind of hard to believe that that person might be reflecting aggression. But there are cultures where if you're interacting with someone and they're smiling, that actually is seen as aggression. So again, opening up our ideas as to what do things actually mean when we start working on an international basis. So, can emotional intelligence help to build cultural humility? Well, let's look at what they have in common here. So, we're starting out with self-reflection, looking at what our beliefs are, how we feel, how might we feel different. Self-inquiry in terms of, gee, maybe that one book I read about this particular culture wasn't exactly accurate. Maybe I can expand myself a little bit more. Awareness of ourselves and awareness of others. And when we get to the culture end of that, we need to understand we may really need to stand back before we react and get a better feel for what is, what's happening with the interaction. What are they actually conveying to us? I like this one here, that sometimes our answers are in the history, and it's true. I mean, even looking at the Greek culture, one of the things that I discovered doing more research is the Greeks, when we talked about Hofstede's different dimensions, the Greeks are on, like, we hate uncertainty. Totally. They're like the number one country. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that explains so much that I never even realized before. It's same with our emotions, though. Where do they start? They start with our history. They start with the family around us in terms of teaching us expression on those emotions. Expansion of our skill set. Again, what I love about both of these is we get to choose. We choose. And so we can choose to expand our skill set so that we can be more inclusive of others. And adopting that open-mindedness that I can learn, not only with our emotions, but also when we approach out to other cultures. So this, I think, is very common between emotional intelligence and cultural humility. Once we can look at humility, then we can grow at that point. And we can look at emotional intelligence, which really kind of helps us measure our knowledge of how cultures are the same, how are they different, and being aware of that history and the values of that particular culture, behaviors, nonverbal and verbal. And also this last one, which I think is important in terms of where's our motivation. So if I'm somebody that is being sent overseas, maybe I have an extrinsic motivation, feeling that, I'm getting paid to do this. And so I'm going to learn a bit about this particular culture, as opposed to then finally adopting that intrinsic motivation where I'm kind of self-propelling myself into learning about other cultures and that. The other part is competency. And again, competency might take a full absorb into a culture anywhere from 5 to 7 years, sometimes even longer. My new daughter-in-law informed me last week, and she thinks it's going to take her about 10 years before she'll fully understand Americans. So that very well could be, who knows with that. But understanding the language and the culture in this, and also understanding, and from a competency point of view, the variances between cultures with that, and that ability to move between cultures and the fluency, being able to, interpret in a language, a second language that isn't our own, and really kind of think through that more like a native rather than always filtering through our own culture on that. So it is a growth step to get to full competency in a particular culture. But again, I think we all can start with humility as being the important part. So does it work, right? Does building something like this work? Well, I'm going back to what I know because of my personal experiences. And, it's hard to believe that when in the 60s and 70s that Northern Ireland was a war zone, Belfast particularly. Um, Protestants were killing Catholics, which again can be a little bit of a foreign idea for us on that end of it. And it just looked like there was no hope in that environment until one man who had been a police officer in New York City went to Ireland. He had Irish roots, and he saw what was going on. And he said to his wife, maybe we could bring kids from Ireland, from the Catholic Catholic community and the Protestant community. Maybe we could bring them back to a neutral place, the United States, and help them to communicate, because there was no communication, no contact going on. And the results of this was what they called Project Children, and it became all over the United States that people housed kids from Ireland. There were camps that were created and other efforts that were created during that time period that took that wall that you see at the left. That was the wall that separated the Catholics from the Protestant. Today, over here in that center picture, it is called the Peace Wall. I saw it 4 years ago now, when I was in Belfast, and they have messages of hope on that wall. And thousands of kids from Ireland have come over. One of my good friends in Colorado hosts kids every year. His mom is Irish, so he has the roots, and they've had kids that have come over that have been so terrified, and sometimes I'm like amazed that the parents have let them do this, that they'll only eat potatoes that they're allowed to go buy in the store initially. And we've had some of the kids, when my kids were teens, we'd have the kids over to our house and such. And so what this did was really build a bridge of understanding. And you can see at the top right a picture of kids getting ready to come over on Irish flight. Belfast today is an innovative city. I'm not saying that all the problems of Northern Ireland were solved with this, but they're not blowing each other up, and they are proceeding without fear, and that is huge. And when we think about how are we going to come together across the world, it's got to be with some understanding on that. So I believe this fully because I've seen it, I've researched it. There is strength in diversity. There are challenges, but there are great opportunities out there for us to engage. I mean, we look at IBM's program that they have where their employees go all over the world for a 6-week period, and they're involved in changing something on a local basis. Maybe it's water, maybe it's education. And many, many companies promote these kind of ideas. And we know from a business point of view, companies that are more diverse at the top are more successful in what they do. So where does it start? Starts with us. I mean, one man took 6 kids and created a whole movement. And there are all kinds of great movements that are going on out there with individuals that are refusing to react in fear, but really say, I'm centered, I know who I am, and I want to go forward with the world and learn more about the people of the world. So we start with ourselves. And who knows then what kind of world that we can all create. You guys have questions? Let me stop sharing here. There we go.
I'll ask you a question.
Okay, sounds good.
We've all experienced in our country the conflict with immigrants.
Yes.
And because we know if we look at both sides of it, both sides have some interesting points. You know, one side wants to have safety. So how would you like to address that issue? You know, because I think when you talk about diversity, part of it might be traveling to other places and visiting other countries, but another is the diversity within our own country.
Yeah,
And how
absolutely.
how do we cope with people's fears of, um, you know, we can work on ourselves, as you just told us, with some great
Right.
ideas. How do we help other people see these things and accept this diversity that
Yeah.
it would make us better rather than to be afraid of it?
Yeah, I think that that's really a challenge because we get a lot of negative feelings, and we get a lot of negative press out there on everything that sounds so awful about things. And the only way that I can think of is really we need to, you know, kind of question people a little bit gently. Like I said, I had people over, I don't know, a few years ago, and I was raised in Dearborn, Michigan. We have a very large Muslim population there. In fact, for 40 years we've had a mosque, an Orthodox church, and a Catholic church, pretty much in sharing the same space with each other very peacefully, I could add, and doing a lot of interchanging. And so I think sometimes we've got to look at what misconceptions do people have with it. I was reading a little while ago. I mean, a lot of people don't understand that many of the immigrants that are coming up are they have education, they have money in the bank, they're leaving a lot behind with that. They don't understand that journey. And I will talk to, like, I have a friend who just doesn't understand that particular journey. Why would somebody do this? And I guess because of hearing the stories from my father-in-law of, they were, Russia was taking the kids from Bulgaria and sending them up to Russia, and his parents helped them escape, and they went to prison. And my father-in-law had a price on his head and couldn't go back to Bulgaria until, Bulgaria finally, moved out of the Soviet Union bloc and such. So I think we have to start in little doses with that. The other thing is, I think being that person that isn't adding fuel to the fire, isn't adding fear, being able to maybe present some information, doing the research ourselves. Because I think sometimes when people bring things up and say, "Oh, it's like this," and we're like, "Well, I'm pretty uninformed, so I don't really understand it." Like, unfortunately, I had a student a few semesters ago that wrote that all Muslims are involved in honor killing, which is certainly not true, but they went to that absolute. And so, can we start breaking down that absolute? Can we start saying, well, the facts of the matter is a lot of Muslim countries never engaged in honor killing, and that it tends to be a small, small group that many times were tribal in nature. that engage and have these ideas. And just like we have different ideas through, our culture, it's the same thing with other cultures. So I think helping to kind of humanize this whole effort of what's happening, we're just at the tip of the iceberg as far as I believe, as to people that are going to be transients in this world. I mean, we're looking, like I said, the Marshall Islands, they're thinking they got to relocate 60,000 people. There are other low-lying seacoast areas that people are going to have to be moved from. There are capital cities like in Africa where they're moving them from the coast and moving them inland already. We haven't quite experienced too much on climate change outside of the wildfires that occurred. And you look at how that has impacted us, where people that I know from Denver are like, gosh, I don't know if I can live in Denver anymore because we may not have them in Colorado, but the smoke is coming in and having an effect on everybody. So realizing that the only way we're going to get out of this is if we really help each other. Our country was really based in diversity. I mean, yes, I agree that each culture, when they came in here, faced their obstacles. I mean, I hear the stories from my mom. Greek kids were segregated in school. My mom and her siblings used to throw their pita bread out on the way to school, and they would beg their mom to, my grandmother to buy them Wonder Bread, which they didn't even know what it was, my mom said, but everybody was talking about it. So they wanted to be, American in that end of it. So, and now, of course, we all love pita bread, right? I'm gluten-free. I'll still do anything to pay for a piece of gluten-free pita bread. So, looking at our history, though, when World War I happened, and this was really interesting to read about, that, here the Americans come into the European theater to, help save Europe and whatever in World War I. And people were taken back, the European countries were taken back because they would have a team of people that were Italians and Greeks and Germans and whatever, solving problems, building bridges and that whole term of like Yankee ingenuity. That is really prevalent in our roots. When we can look at diversity and bring it together because we all come together in different strengths, that's another way to really approach this. We can choose to go through the world in love or in fear. And, and a lot of times people don't take responsibility for that. It's interesting in my class, I do an experiment where I ask students, how do you want your life to feel? And we draw a big circle. And students will yell out, oh, I want joy, I want happiness, I want this and that. The two emotions that they never say. And I will sit there and say, you guys got to go deeper. And I'll do this with clients too. You got to go deeper. You got to go deeper. Love and appreciation. Every single time. Every single time. So why aren't we choosing that? And most people, why do they leave their jobs? Because they feel unappreciated. And we're not even asking for appreciation in our lives. So, I think sometimes we got to turn off what's going on in the media or social media. We've got to get our brain kind of calm down and get out of the fear of it. And I think that's the long-winded answer. And I'm sure I'm sitting on a soapbox somewhere here in this room of what I think is the way out of it. I see it as individuals doing individual things. And I will say to you all, look for a movement that is going on worldwide. And I've talked about this in the past, and that's leading from the middle. And there are amazing things that are happening around the world. We see all the gunk at the top, where things don't seem to function. But the people out there are not waiting for that. They're doing all kinds of different things. And one group that I watch that I have a lot of respect for is what we call a Cajun Navy. They, when and again, from my family history, the rest of my dad's family had to vacate New Orleans because of Katrina, and we have no direct family there after like 250 years. But the Cajun Navy were just these volunteers, and they're really cool how they came together. They all played this same video game, and they started communicating through this video game. And people are like, I have a boat, I can help, and I'll show up here. And today, they don't even know how many members they have. I mean, they totally radicalized how water rescue is done. People don't understand that during Camille, a lot of people died because they wouldn't leave their pets. Because we didn't rescue pets. We didn't rescue pets from fires. We didn't rescue them from floods. When rescues came, people said, I'm not leaving my dog. And they died with their animal. And the Cajun Navy said, we don't know how we're going to solve this problem, but we're getting on social media and we're getting people that will help us. And that's what they did. And now part of rescue all the time is rescuing animals as well as humans. And you look at change after change after change. They start a worldwide movement. And a couple, I don't know, I guess it was about a month ago, where they were responding to another storm down in Louisiana. And they were interviewing the gentleman who's the president of the foundation. So they have a foundation that raises money. And they said, how many members do you have? And he goes, I don't know. We just put out the word and people show up. But sometimes we got to put out the word, right? On that. And it was funny because the guy interviewing him couldn't wrap his brain around that. He's like, 1,000? Do you have 1,000? Do you have 4,000? The guy's like, no idea. We just put out the need and people come and answer the need. So that's what I would say we need to look at. Rather than what all the noises up here, let's go person to person and go out into the world and learn for ourselves and start movements that are amazing out there. Little kids starting bikes for Haiti after the earthquake, 9 and 10 years old, redoing bikes and sending them over there. A lot of great things going on. Other questions? Yes.
So this is more in the vein of emotional intelligence rather than cultural intelligence. But what do you think is the best way to be proactive when you feel or when you see emotional contagion occurring?
For like if you're catching someone, I will tell you unequivocally, and I wouldn't have believed this when I was in the corporate world at all. I researched it. My husband would tell me all the time when I come home, you're so stressed, you need to breathe. And that's the biggest thing. So we're unaware of the fact that our breathing patterns have changed. So think of it as like a signal. And we work amazingly well. But if we're sitting in a meeting where people start getting fearful, or anywhere where people, maybe they're having a bad day, maybe they don't know where they're going to stay that night, and they're in turmoil, and they start holding their breath or they start shallow breathing. That's a signal to other humans that there's some kind of danger. So they're admitting danger in the world. And, that was a great tool that we used to use when, early man walking through the forest and our human with us starts responding. But we stay in that state because we start mimicking their breathing patterns. Then we're anxious and we're like, I don't even know where my good mood went from. And so the biggest thing that we can do is really be aware of our breathing patterns. and to fully breathe. Meditation, I think, is a great thing to do. Even like in our exercise, years ago, I started doing, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years ago, spin. And I realized during the time that I was doing it, and I had probably doing this all through my life when I exercised, I was holding my breath. I was not breathing. And of course, if you're doing spin and you're not breathing, it's never going to be a good result. And I have to actually concentrate on my breathing. I had to really teach myself how to breathe again, because years in corporate, in a very, I was a single mom. I was working a really high power situation, 100% commission. I loved what I did, but I was under a lot of stress. And so the breathing aspect is where I would start all the way around. Be aware of how you are breathing. And that'll help keep you calmer. And meditation. Good question.
Do you have any advice for us, Diane, about lots of our students will be parents someday if they aren't already? And what would be a good way to start raising kids right away to be culturally aware?
Yeah.
Can you give some ideas?
Yeah, I that was actually my former husband and I didn't agree on a lot, but we did agree about the fact that we wanted to have kids that were good citizens of the world. So teaching them about culture, number one, became important. Exposing them to different cultures. An easy way to start is go to a restaurant that you're unfamiliar with. Sharing food. The one great thing about Detroit, because we had such an international group, we used to have festivals along the riverfront, and we'd have Greek and, of course, Greek is the only one I can remember, but German and Irish and, Saudi Arabia and get around people from different cultures. And a good way to do it is through food. So I think by parents making a conscious decision, we ended up, it was interesting. We had a restaurant, a Nepal restaurant open close to our house in Colorado. And so we all decided to go. And my son said to me at that time, Mom, I'm really uncomfortable. These people are very different than us. And I said to him, we call him Zach. His name is Strofko. I said, this is things that people used to say about your grandparents, about your grandmother, and about your grandfather. Why don't we just sit with this for a while and see how you feel, after we have a little bit of interaction. And that became our favorite restaurant to go to. And my kids are just, they're always interested in other cultures. My daughter for a while was engaged to a man from New Zealand. And so, opening that door and making it okay and talking about our culture. Our Christmas dinner is a combination of Greek, Bulgarian, and New Orleans. So, it's making it a point to really talk about it. My daughter, she used to really crack me up, because when she was dating people, even in high school, she would take them into the restaurant that I'm talking about. And if people were just like, I can't eat here, I'm too uncomfortable, she was like, all right, that's probably not somebody I want to be around, because I want someone that can really appreciate different cultures. And by the way, that restaurant owner has 5 restaurants now in Colorado. And we kind of saw it build from nothing, where he was then able to bring his wife and kids over. And it's pretty exciting to see somebody build a business like that and have so much success and have fantastic food too. So yeah, food's a great place to start, guys. Go to like what we have, the Chinese Cultural Center. go up there and visit up there. It's a little bit harder here in Detroit area. We had, like, if you want to publish food in experience, you went to the Polish part of town or the Greek. We had a big Greek town. When I moved to Denver, I'm like, gosh, where am I going to go get the kind of pasta I need to make the food I want? And they're like, oh, we have a Greek town here. And, the first few times driving up and down Colfax Boulevard, I'm like, where is it? Where is it? Yeah, it's one restaurant and a little tiny bakery. I was used to the whole neighborhood being, part of the Greek community and such. So sometimes we have to search it out. The festivals, we just had a Greek festival here not too long ago. Look for different festivals. And like I said, start with food. Go to an Indian restaurant. We're finally getting some good ones here and such. So.
I think I wanted just to emphasize what you're saying about stepping outside of your comfort zone. Yeah. Even as small children, it's even better if you teach them to do that. But even as an adult, I require all my students, some of you students here have already done yours, but I require them to attend a cultural event. Because when you're there, when you're talking to people and when you're learning about it,
yeah, it
kind of just breaks down that wall and you get more curious and the fear goes away. And you're right, it is evolutionary. We have that for a reason. So don't feel bad if you do feel fear, but it's easy to overcome it by just improving the contact, between individuals and groups of people. So
yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. You had awesome things to say today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk, and thank you everyone for attending today.
Thank you for having me.
Now. Always.
You're a big supporter of Psi Beta.
Yeah, I love this organization. I have to say, it's like my wise person organization, as I sometimes call it, because I hate missing meetings because I learn so much from them. And, I just really appreciate that opportunity to attend.
It's a good way for, I know students don't like all the work involved in being in school, but I think when you get to keep learning, it's a wonderful feeling, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah. Got to keep that mind going, especially at my age.
Wouldn't it be nice if it were easier to travel all around the world and see lots of different cultures? It's too bad it's expensive and difficult to do, but that would be wonderful.
Well, when I was 19, I always wanted to go to Europe. I had plans on it. I got a job that said I'd keep the job for 3 years. So that was when I was 16. I got this wild hair when I was 16. And at 19, I got on a plane for the first time in my life. I was flying to London. I had a backpack. I had a sleeping bag. I had no idea where I was staying. To this day, I'm like, why didn't my parents lock me in the basement? Because this was just crazy. And for 3 months, I traveled by train and youth hostel and slept in parks sometimes. A lot of people were doing that. Met people, got taken in by people, and it was like a magical experience. I did that for 3 months, and